And so I would broadly define social cognition as the study of knowledge about the social world, and mostly people, groups, culture, and it accounts for how that knowledge is organized, the kind of the mapping of your belief system, your knowledge about yourself, people around you, the culture you may identify with, and then it also shed light on the processes. How do you activate certain pieces of knowledge, how they affect your judgment, your behavior. So it's both the focus on the structure, the mapping of a knowledge system, and then the more, in my opinion, more interesting, the more dynamic aspects of those things come into play in face-to-face interaction, in the particular settings, point to the malleability of our beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors.
How does that identity sort of manifest in terms of behaviors and thoughts? And then I think the other piece is, how do interactions with others have implications for thoughts and behaviors?
Absolutely. And so one of the distinctions that I tend to focus on is this idea that your knowledge, your beliefs, your identities operate at two different levels. And to me, the narrative part is capturing this kind of very conscious, deliberate sense of who I am, what my identity is. And so if you are a bicultural, multicultural person, you may consider that both of those cultures, that you are a product of various cultures, that they are very important to you, that you cherish them both, that they define who you are. But if we talk about that, if we share our experience, our perspective, that to me is capturing something that is very deliberate, very conscious, that I can structure. I have control over how I present myself to the world. And that's
what we believe, that we have that much control over our expression of that identity.
Exactly, and that's very important. I don't want to dismiss that. It's very central to who you are. But it's also the case that in our everyday life, the culture that we are the product of, or the multiple culture that shape us, often operate at a much more, below the surface, automatic, unconscious manner. So the way I talk, my facial expression, how I react to what you may say, and all those stuff, I think that I'm not very much in control, that are operating on this kind of automatic, unconscious level, and that are still probably a reflection of my cultural upbringing that define who I am. And so those things to me are equally important as the more, conscious narrative. And sometimes they may tell the same story, and in other case, they may reveal very different facets of who I am. And so this distinction is a bit artificial, right? Things are not always, purely conscious, deliberative, or purely unconscious, or automatic. Very often what we do as we talk, for example, right now, is kind of a mix of, I put some thinking in terms of what I say to you, but there are also things that I do not fully control. When I start a sentence, I don't know how it will end, kind of thing. So, and there are other aspects of my facial expression and so on that, again, I'm not aware, or I'm not fully able to control. So to me, that kind of dual aspect of psychological life is very important. And so sometimes there are actually disconnect between how you think of yourself, the deliberate, the narrative, and how the system actually is operating actions.
Yeah, and I think at its core, it makes sense, but at the same time, it's one of those things that I think some of us have a hard time swallowing without, at least, if you want to apply it to your own life, without some good examples. And I wonder, if I had to challenge you a little bit, is to say, to the people who don't necessarily believe that there are these two levels of consciousness, and that they influence things like attitudes and behavior, or expression of attitudes and behavior, is there a good example that really convinces most people that this is solid stuff?
Sure. And one example I like to use is, let's say your phone is ringing, you're picking up the phone. Depending who is in the other line, there may be a different identity that comes to the surface without you realizing. Is it your mom, the work setting, your culture of origin, or is it your research advisor who kind of embody the SDSU culture on this campus? So those things overlap, but maybe they are distinct at some level. And so over the course of the day, we kind of alternate who we are as a function of the tasks that we are doing, who we are interacting with, and so the cultural influences will again shape maybe our thinking, our way of responding to what the other person is saying in a way that does not require you being very deliberate, thoughtful about what is going on.
Some of the early psychologists who were considered fathers for, at the risk of sounding sexist, of the notion of Chicano psychology, they actually had, and they came from psych and education, described essentially what you're talking about as cognitive flex.
Mm-hmm.
So this ability to manage between contexts, essentially, and it seems that the thing that alerts your mind, even if it's unconsciously, to make a shift is some stimulus from the environment.
So in this case, you try to apply a theory to kind of real life setting, a rich cultural experience. What to me is interesting also is how when you do that, you kind of enrich your understanding of the basic processes of how the mind works. Like initially, social cognition was not that social, right? It was applying models that were developed in the cognitive science with, it's about people, it's about the self, that kind of stuff. And as we apply that to, again, more complex world, we realize that, the mind can do things that are way more complex, or the interconnection between the environment, the culture, and what you do with bits of information are, again, a lot more complex than simply a simple model that is the same for everyone.
Where we left the class last was talking about how cultural influences thoughts and behavior. And now, with this notion of biculturalism and social cognition, we've added a whole other layer to that complexity, because on the surface it assumes, okay, and then the product is X. But social cognition says the product can be X, Y, and Z depending on the situation. So one person could draw on the cultural influences in different ways at different times, right?
Absolutely.